I don't usually post. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything weird. This is just what happened to me and my boyfriend on a 2-day backpacking trip last fall. It wasn't our first overnight, but we're not hardcore either. We do weekend loops close to home, keep our gear simple, and stick to marked trails. We picked a long but moderately popular trail because the reviews said it had reliable water, decent campsites, and one stretch with good views across a valley. Nothing about it felt like a gamble. The weather was clear. The high was in the low 70s with a breeze, and the forecast mentioned a bright moon after dark. We left a simple plan with my sister where we'd park, our loop direction when we expected to be back, and we carried a small first aid kit, a whistle, a PLB we rarely use, and the usual overnight stuff. I say all of that because we weren't winging it. We did it the way you're supposed to. We started late in the morning and took it slow. The trail climbed in gentle switchbacks through mixed forest and then settled into a long contour around the shoulder of a ridge. We saw today hikers and a trail runner in the first few miles, then no one. The path was obvious, a little dusty from a dry spell, and the wind came through in soft pushes that moved the tops of the trees and then passed on like a wave. We didn't talk much, we just fell into the rhythm of stepping over roots, checking the map and the wayfinding posts at junctions, and keeping an eye on our water. The stream crossings were as advertised, knee-high at worst, mostly ankle, and the water was clear, but left a mineral taste on the tongue. We stopped twice to snack and once to retape a hot spot on my heel. All of this is boring detail, but to me, it matters because the day itself was ordinary in a way that throws what came later into sharp relief. There was nothing else strange, no out-of-place sounds, no bad feeling, nothing you could point to and go, "That's when it started." We made camp in late afternoon. The site we chose was a small oval of flattened duff under 2 big firs and a sugar pine with a thin line of trees behind us and an open view straight across the valley to a parallel ridge line about a mile away. The spot looked used but not abused. No fire ring, no trash, just the flat where a lot of people had likely pitched tents before. The trail passed 30 yards below and then continued along the contour to our right, tucked back in the trees. It was the kind of place people pick because it's easy, level, near a creek you can hear but not see, a few branches for a bare hang, and that view. The clearing itself wasn't big, maybe 20 steps across, and ringed with sweet fern and knee-high grass where the duff gave way. We dropped our packs, walked the perimeter to make sure there weren't widow makers overhead, and then divided jobs without talking. He set the tent. I went down to the creek to fill the COC bag and bring water back to filter. From the edge of the clearing, you could see the opposite ridge cleanly. It wasn't an overlook with a bench or a sign, just a straight shot through the gap in our trees, like a window. The ridge looked gentle and even, a line of darker green laid against the pale sky. No trails I knew of ran right along that exact spine. The main route went lower, traversing below the summit and then dipping toward a saddle. I know this because I looked at the map and the printed profile while I waited for the filter to do its slow drip into our bottles. The sun was lowering, but not gone. It had that gold tone you get when it's starting to think about leaving. The air was cooler. I could smell the creek in the warm sap. The first moment I felt anything like unease. I was 3 steps from the tent with the water. I looked up, not for any reason I remember, and saw the figure on the ridge line. It was the shape of a person standing still against the sky, not sitting, not hunched, upright, feet apart like someone at rest, arms at their sides. It looked small because of the distance, but there was no mistaking the proportions. Head, shoulders, torso, legs. I stopped walking. For a second, I told myself it could be a snag or a stump, but the ridge had been a smooth treed line all day. We had both looked at it while we pitched the tent and laughed about how we de-scored $1 million view. There had been nothing like a snag sticking up and nothing that cut the line of the trees like that. I told my boyfriend to look. He did. He squinted, then put a hand up to shade his eyes, "Is that a person?" he asked. I didn't answer, because I was still trying to make some non-weird explanation fit. Maybe there was a small rocky outcrop with a weirdly human silhouette we hadn't noticed before. Maybe a hiker had gone off-trail to get a view we couldn't see. It didn't feel like a scenic overlook, though. It was just a random high point among trees with no break in the canopy below it. I pulled out my phone and tried to zoom in. The image steadied, then blurred, then steadied again, all pixels and contrast. The shape was there, clean outline head. The block of a torso, no color detail, no movement. We watched for 10 minutes, not an estimate. I checked my watch because I didn't want to exaggerate. It was at least 10 minutes. During that time, the wind moved our branches. Small insects skated through the light. The figure did not shift, not even the way a person's weight shifts over time. No head tilt, no arm motion, no glint of a phone or a water bottle, no raised hand. If someone stands still and looks at something, they still micro-move. A foot clears a stone, a shoulder rolls. This didn't. It reminded me of the times you see a statue at a distance, and for a second, your brain treats it like a person before you realize it's not alive. But there aren't statues up on remote ridges. We tried to treat it like nothing. We finished filtering water. He boiled water for dinner. And we ate with our backs to the tent, facing the view like we'd planned. If it was a person, fine. People day hike to weird places and do weird things. We've all seen folks walk off trail to stand on a boulder. If it was a snag, the light would change and prove our eyes were playing tricks. Yet, as the sun dropped, the silhouette held. The sky went from pale to orange to a bruised color. The ridge went from green to black. The figure went from a cutout of dark against light to a notch of darker against dark. The feeling I had about it wasn't fear yet. It was the same alertness you have when something is just off. An engine noise that isn't right, a dog that won't come when called. My boyfriend said, "Weird place to stand." I agreed. We hung our food in a spot that gave us the best angles from the tent. We stowed toiletries. We checked that we could find our headlamps in the dark without rummaging. The normal end of day routine felt like a list we had to complete more carefully than usual. We didn't light a fire. Fires weren't banned that week, but we weren't planning on one, and I didn't feel like pulling in more attention. The moon rose later than the sunset and cleared the ridge slowly. You could feel the temperature fall, see your breath for a minute, and then the light came up enough to throw faint shadows across our clearing. We zipped the tent and lay down with that small thrill you get when the day's weight comes off your feet. The last thing I saw before we closed the fly was the opposite ridge. Now a single black line. No notch, no shape. I took that as proof that the silhouette had been a trick of contrast. I woke up needing to pee. It wasn't a panicked wake-up. It was the calm, irritating kind where you lie there and try to will it away and then accept you're going to have to crawl out of your warm bag. The tent was lit in that soft way you get when there's a big moon. I checked my watch because I always do. It read something like 2:30 in the morning. The woods were quiet, no wind, just the creek. And even that was muffled. My boyfriend was breathing in that deep, even way that means he won't wake up for small sounds. I slid my headlamp around my neck, but I didn't click it on. I unzipped the inner mesh and then the fly very slowly so the sound wouldn't rip. I pushed the vestibule aside and stepped out in my socks. The clearing was brighter than I expected. I could see detail. Grains of dust on the tent, the outline of our bear hang line against the branch. Individual blades of grass laid over by the day's foot traffic. I turned my head toward the gap in the trees out of a habit I can't explain and saw immediately that the ridge was empty. No notch, no person shape. It was just a line. I told myself that was closure and took 2 steps away from the tent toward the edge of the clearing where the bushes gave a little privacy. That was when I froze. Not because of a sound. There was nothing. Not because of a smell. Because of the edge of the clearing on the far side, near where the grass thinned back into the duff under the trees. A person was standing there, not on the ridge a mile away. Right there, maybe 40 yards from our tent. At the edge where the moonlight stopped and the first darkness of the trees began, upright, arms at their sides, facing us. It didn't process at first. I think I tried to make it into a tree. I remember locking my eyes on it and telling myself to find the branch that would give it away. Trees have taper, knots, texture that resolves when you stare. This didn't. It had the clean outline of a head, the angle of shoulders, the vertical run of a torso, the straightness of legs. I couldn't see the face. The moon was behind it and a little right, so the front was in shadow. There was no headlamp, no reflective band, no pack I could make out, just the shape of a person, the kind of idea of a person your brain holds, even when the details are erased. I didn't speak. I didn't run. I didn't do anything dramatic. I turned very slowly and crouched back into the tent the way you do when you don't want anything to notice a movement. I slid the zipper down as quietly as I could and pressed my hand over my boyfriend's shoulder and then his mouth, because I knew the first thing he would do was say what out loud. He woke with a jerk, heard the air come through his nose hard, and I whispered in the smallest voice I could make. Someone is standing at the edge of the clearing. Don't talk. Don't turn on your light. He went still in a way I have only seen him do once. When a car almost slid into us on black ice, I felt his breathing change. He nodded under my hand. We waited like that for a long 3 or 4 breaths, while my heart beat so hard I thought it would move the nylon. Then, without speaking, we started doing a thing that looking back I think we both decided on at the exact same time. We packed the essentials inside the tent. No zippers, no stepping outside. We worked by the moonlight coming through the mesh by feel. I pulled on my pants and socks and shoved my feet into my boots without lacing them. He slid on his base layer and fleece. I pushed our headlamps into the pockets in the tent roof so they wouldn't glare if they clicked on. He rolled our sleeping bags into messy bundles and stuffed them loose into our packs. I unsnapped the stove from the vestibule and brought it inside. We dialed down our movements to only what we had to do when a strap slid against nylon. We paused and waited for the sound to settle like dust. We didn't touch the bear hang. It was out by the same edge of the clearing where the person stood. I didn't want to give any reason to move around outside. I kept picturing stepping out and having to turn my back to that edge to pull on the cord. After the first minute, when the automatic jitters burned off, I felt this clear, weird focus. I could hear everything. There were no cicadas, no wind. The creek was distance only. The person at the edge didn't move. I mean that literally. I watched through the smallest gap in the door, through the silver of the mesh, and the person's outline stayed the same. Not the little shifts a person does when they stand too long. There was none of that. I tried to listen for breathing and heard nothing. That didn't mean anything. The distance and the creek anyway. But I tried. I tried to count seconds to see if anything in their posture changed. Nothing did. We had a conversation without talking. I tapped my boyfriend's wrist to ask if he wanted to try to leave in the dark. He shook his head once. We've both been caught night hiking when the trail is less obvious than it looked on a map. And it's not like the movies where a flashlight makes everything simple. With deadfall and faint sidetracks and one wrong contour, you can end up wandering into a drainage or circling back toward the same place you started. The idea of moving away from the tent into the trees with an unknown person 20 or 30 paces from us felt worse than waiting. We chose to sit up, packs ready, and watch. If the person came closer, we would speak, but not before. If the person charged the tent, we had trekking poles, pepper spray, and a whistle. The PLB felt stupid in that moment. It's for when you break a leg in tails or get pinned by a log. Not for there's someone just standing there. Time stretched. I checked my watch once, cupping it to block the light. It said something like to 48. The next time I looked carefully, it was after 3. We took turns keeping eyes on that edge of the clearing. And each time one of us leaned forward to look, the outline was there, same as before. I started to get practical worries that had nothing to do with fear. My bladder hurt, my legs cramped from kneeling. The tent fabric ticked when it cooled, Every small sound from inside felt like a flare going up. When a pine needle dropped on the fly, I flinched so hard I bumped the pole. Not once did the person step forward or back. Not once did they raise their hands. I kept telling myself it could still be a visual trick. That maybe a trunk and a broken branch made a shape my brain insisted was human, but I monitored for the kind of change that would show it was wood. Wind pushing us sway when a gust came, the moon angle shifting and turning an arm into a limb. The wind never picked up, the outline never wavered. If you think I'm adding color, I'm not. That was the fact of it. It stayed shaped like a person through the time it takes for your eyes to adjust. Your hope to map trees where there are none and your nerves to settle into a beat. My boyfriend leaned forward once carefully and breathed in like he was smelling something. Later, he said he thought he caught a faint whiff of cold earth and sweat like you get off a hat band after a long day. I didn't smell anything. I kept trying to make out whether the head was bare or hooded, and I couldn't. It was a perfect blank. I wanted to ask out loud over and over, "Do you see it?" But I didn't. I didn't want words to make anything tip from strange into engagement. Around what I think was for or so, the cold found the small of my back in a way I knew meant we were on the downside of the night. The moon had shifted and the shadows moved, the outline remained. There was a window of time, maybe 5 minutes, when a small cloud took the moon and the clearing went from silver to near black. During that time, we held absolutely still because it felt like the lights going off in a hallway while someone stands at the far end. When the moon slid free again, everything was the same. Tent, grass, tree line, and the person where they'd been. At the first hint of dawn, and I mean the first thin light that isn't moon but not yet sun, the person moved. It was smooth, without hurry, like someone stepping into a grocery aisle because they realized they'd been standing in front of the same shelf too long. They turned, not in segments, not with a glitch. They pivoted and walked into the trees at an angle that took them parallel to the trail, deeper into the forest, not toward the creek. There was no crunch of leaves, no snap of a twig. I waited for it because the ground around that edge had a scatter of sticks we noticed setting camp, the kind that always give at least one sharp crack underfoot. I heard none. We didn't talk then either. We unzipped and packed the tent like it mattered if we left in 10 minutes or 5. We didn't touch the bare hang. I left it. If that bothers anyone reading this, I understand. But the idea of walking to that tree and pulling that cord down and feeding the line while I watched the dark between trunks was not something I could do. We shouldered our packs with the straps loose and got onto the trail with a rhythm that felt like a jog. Even though I'm sure to anyone watching, we looked like two people walking too fast with poor balance. The first mile and a half out, you pass 3 spurs that look like real trails until you notice the angle is wrong and the tread is soft with needles. On the way in, we had paused at each to check the post in the map. On the way out, we went straight through all 3 without a pause because we knew the route from yesterday's walk, and also because stopping felt like announcing yourself. I kept checking behind us, not constantly, because constantly makes you crazy, but in regular intervals, every 100 steps or so. I never saw anyone. We didn't eat. We sipped water without stopping. When the trail turned from pine duff to the dusty tread of the start, I could smell the parking lot the way you do. The faint scent of oil and hot plastic that means you're near a road. When we reached the car, we didn't explode into panic like a movie. We loaded our bags, sat down, and locked the doors without saying anything. Then my boyfriend put his head on the steering wheel for a second in a way I've only seen after funerals. We both laughed once, not because it was funny, but because my body had been holding one breath for hours and it finally let go. On the drive out, we passed a small pull-off with a map board. A Forest Service truck was parked there, empty. We didn't see a ranger. We didn't stop. There's a small ranger office near the highway where the road widens for snow plows. We pulled in and stared at the door. Neither of us got out. I don't know what we would have said if we had. Hi, a person stood and watched us for an hour and then walked away. It doesn't sound like a crime. People camp near people all the time. People go to weird places and look at other people. We had no description beyond human-shaped, no visible face, no clothes we could name. We went home, we unpacked our gear in silence. I opened the food bag and threw away anything that smelled like camp because the association made me nauseous. 3 days later, I called the ranger district. A woman answered and asked me what I was reporting. I told her as plainly as I could. She was kind. She asked if we felt followed on the hike out, if we'd seen any tracks or signs of a camp near ours, if there were recent reports of break-ins at the trailhead. I told her no to the first, no to the second, and I didn't know about the third. She said they hadn't had any complaints that week, but she'd make a note and have someone swing the area. She asked if we'd notice blaze orange or camo, because the start of small game season sometimes brings people out at night and they stand still, or it can be stargazers who walk without lights. I told her we hadn't seen orange and that the person stood exactly at the line where the clearing stopped. I didn't know what a stargazer would be doing at a random edge like that. She said sometimes folk don't think about how they come off to others. She apologized that it made us feel unsafe. She was professional and calm. I appreciated that more than I knew how to say. The thing I returned to in my head, in that someone watched us. It's how still they were. It's not how a person rests. It's how a target sits on a range. I've ever played it in my mind 1,000 times trying to even find a tiny motion I missed. There isn't one. My boyfriend brings up the lack of sound when they walked away. He's not making a point about ghosts. He's making a point about weight and ground and the fact that even careful steps have texture. He says he heard nothing and he was listening like I was. We both agree on that. We haven't camped since. We keep saying we will car camp near a busy lake or rent a cabin or do a short out and back to shake it off. But when it gets real, we find other plans. I still hike. I still love the smell of pine needles heating up on a shoulder season day. And the way trail just clings above your socks. But when a path bends and you can see the opposite ridge through a window in the trees, I look too long. If there's any dark notch that could be a person, I stare and stare until my eyes water. Nothing has been there since. Maybe once there was nothing there that night either. Maybe the ridge shape tricked us, and what stood at the edge of the clearing was a tree I couldn't reconcile. I know what my eyes told me and how my body reacted. I know the way the tent felt tight as a drum over my chest while we waited for light. I know the first sound that morning wasn't bird song, but our own breath loud in our ears when we realized we could finally stand up. If you're reading this thinking, why didn't you shout? Why didn't you call out and fix it? I do and have an answer that will make sense to you if you have and sat where we sat. Silence felt like the only control we had. We didn't want to give whoever it was any of our voice. We didn't want to move their needle. We wanted the clock to do its one job and carry us to daylight. It did. The person left at first light as calmly as if they'd been waiting for a bus. We walked the 12 meters back without stopping, as if sitting down would let the night catch up. That's the whole story. No twist, no discovery of tracks in the morning, no missing time. Just a human shape holding still on a ridgeline at dusk and then taking our place at the edge of our clearing in the middle of the night. If someone has a clean explanation, I don't mind hearing it. All I know is we did everything by the book, and it didn't protect us from the simplest thing. A stranger, silent and still, standing just within the light. The trail I am talking about is one I've done so many times I could walk it without thinking. I started using it when I moved here because it had everything I wanted from a long day. Steady elevation, a couple of creek crossings that kept you honest, a high point with a view that actually made the climb worth it, and enough foot traffic that you could nod to someone every few miles without feeling watched. I used that trail to test packs and boots, to break in a new filter, to get my lungs back after winter. If I only had one day in a week to get outside and clear my head, that was the loop. I knew where the blazes changed color. I knew where the wind funneled across the ridge even on calm days. I knew which switchback held snow the longest in the shoulder season. It wasn't a trophy hike, it was my baseline. I went alone. That's not unusual for me. I'm in my 30s, fit, comfortable with maps, and not out there doing stunts. Standard kit, 20 day, printed topo with a plastic sleeve, compass on the lanyard, phone with the map tiles downloaded, and the phone in airplane mode. Headlamp with fresh batteries, filter, small first aid kit, knife, lighter, emergency blanket. The food you throw in a bag without thinking. Peanut butter wraps, a bar that tastes like a candle. A salty handful of something. It was early fall, clear morning, dry trail, not hot. I parked where I always park, nodded to the same old kiosk at the trailhead with the same sun-faded warnings, and started up at a steady pace. It was a day where everything slides into rhythm. Boots and breath, bugs stayed down. The only noise was the creak on my left and the occasional jay that wanted everyone to know I was there. About 5 miles in, right past a spot where the trail swings away from the creek and starts to gain real ground, I saw the first orange ribbon. It was tied to a branch at shoulder height. One neat square knot, tails cut clean, not the old bleach tape you sometimes see from a trail crew years back. This was bright, the kind of orange that still carries the factory sheen. It wasn't on the blaze line. It was 10, maybe 15 feet off to the right, angled up into a gap between two hemlocks. I stopped because it popped out so hard against the green that it felt like a sign meant for me. I looked for more and found another one, maybe 30 yards further in that same direction. My first thought was the practical one. They must be flagging a route. That section had been eroding for a while. If storms knocked more of the bench out, it would make sense for the rangers to move people to firmer ground. I've seen that done. They flagged a corridor, run some crews through with palisaces, cut the duff back, and by the next season, you're walking the new line without thinking about the old one. It fit the pattern. I don't make a habit of leaving the established trail for no reason, but I do pay attention to this kind of work because it affects where my feet go. I stepped off the main tread and followed the first ribbon. Underfoot, it didn't look like a game trail. It looked like someone had been through with loppers. The tips on a few low branches were clean, not broken. There were faint scuffs in the leaf litter that looked human, not deer. The second ribbon led to a third. By the fourth, I was committed. They were spaced the way I'd expect, close enough that you could see one from the last if you were looking. I was looking. The woods tightened as I moved. The main trail had a wide, airy feel to it. Big trees, open understory, but this flagged line pushed me into younger growth. Saplings crowded each other. The canopy came down. Light felt different, more green. I had to duck once under a branch that should have been trimmed if a crew was serious about getting packs through there. I made a note of it and assumed it was just early days. You don't open a corridor in a single pass, you flag it. You see how it lays, then you come back with tools. Birds were quiet. I told myself that had more to do with the hour than where I was. I kept an eye on the orange flashes and tried to picture how a new tread would snake through. How they'd cut drainages across the slope where they'd anchor a turn with a rock. The part of me that likes tidy lines was already approving decisions that probably hadn't been made. I followed those ribbons for something like 20 minutes. I wasn't watching the clock. I was moving the way you move when you're rescanning for the next marker and not thinking of much else. Then I realized I hadn't seen one in a while. Not a long while, but long enough that the pattern broke. I slowed, did the thing where you stop and turn your head because maybe you just missed one at a weird angle. Nothing. I took 3 steps back, then 3 more, trying to pick up the last clear point in the chain. It's easy to lose detail in dead leaves. Colors flatten. I didn't like that I'd let the gap grow without noticing. That's on me. I took a breath, pulled the phone from the hip belt, and checked the map. No bars, that's normal out there. The map tiles were there, but the GPS jittered. It had my dot somewhere to the right of the real trail, which made sense, but the drift was big, and the accuracy ring-pulse like it couldn't get a lock. I held my arm up out of instinct, like maybe that would help it see the sky through the leaves. It settled and then drifted again. That's not a reason to panic. GPS can lose precision under canopy. That's why you bring a compass. I tucked the phone away and shot a bearing back toward where I knew the main trail ran, then turned around to pick up the line I just walked. I scanned for the last ribbon. I could not find it. I don't mean I looked for 2 seconds and gave up. I stepped back in a slow grid, looking for flash or not, for the way the sun glances off that kind of plastic. I saw bits of fungus and spider silk and one tattered piece of old blue tape that had nothing to do with what I was following. I didn't see orange, the small, stupid heat that starts in your chest when something simple stops being simple crept up a notch. I told myself it was okay. I had a bearing. The main trail was a clay ribbon wide enough to hit even with a sloppy line. I took 3 more steps back and paused. Off deeper, maybe 50 yards ahead on a faint downhill angle, I saw a new flash of orange. That's the kind of moment where you make a decision that reads fine on a message board and feels bad in your bones. The logical thing, what I would tell someone else, was discard the tape, trust your tools, go to the known line. But the tape was what I'd been following, and it had the weight of an authority it didn't deserve. The new ribbon was obvious and recent and in the direction I wanted to travel. I rationalized it. Maybe the corridor took a jog. Maybe whoever flagged it ran out of tape for a stretch and picked it up again. I moved toward it. The ground pulled me down. It wasn't a steep slope, but the micro choices I made kept favoring downhill. The next ribbon hung damp on a twig at my eye level. Then another, each one just far enough to keep me in them. The air cooled. I lost most of the big trees and moved into a stand where trunks were wrist thick and close enough that you could swing your arms wide. At one point, my pack brushed something and made a sound that wasn't branch against nylon, more like plastic rubbing over plastic. I turned and saw a short, fresh stub where something had been cut. The angle was clean and white and still wet. It looked like it had been done that morning. There were other little signs if you cared to see them. A boot edge where duff was cleared from a rock, a soft, flattened path that didn't read like deer. I wasn't following animal behavior. I was following someone's decisions. The ribbons led me to a clearing I don't have a better word for than perfect. Not perfect as in pretty, perfect as in complete. It was a circle not wider than 20 feet, empty down to bare earth in the middle and kept that way. No sticks, no leaves, no stray fern heads. The ring was crisp where it met the rest of the forest floor. Someone made it and had been making it for a while. In the center was a deer. I hunt sometimes, and I feel just a deer with buddies in the legal season. So, when I say this was done clean, I'm not guessing. Whoever opened that deer knew exactly where to cut. The belly was split from brisket to pelvis in a straight line. Not the jagged work you get when somebody is learning in the field. The ribs were exposed, white, and rinsed. There wasn't a mess. The entrails were not scattered. They were gone. The head was intact. Both antlers had the same bright orange tape tied to them in neat bands, tails trimmed. There were no ash piles, no beer cans, none of the trash that says sloppy. It looked like a station. That's the word that came into my head. A place where a task gets done. I didn't know how long I stood there, because time does something dumb when your brain is trying to file a shape into a drawer you do and have. I wasn't shocked by the idea of a deer being cut open. I was shocked by the sterile feeling of it and by the tape on the antlers like some kind of label. The only smell was iron and that sweet rot that comes quick even on a cool day. Flies were there, but not in a cloud. I remember the sound of one against my cheek because everything else was quiet. Then I heard the whistling. If you've ever blown across the mouth of a bottle to make a note, it had that same hollow, thin tone. High, not shrill, not musical. It came from behind me and just to the right, close enough that the hair on my arms lifted before the sound fully registered. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't whined in a weird crack. It was someone making a sound. The word someone landed very clearly in my head. I turned because that's what you do. I didn't see anyone. I saw dark verticals of trunks and the mid-story and the angle of a slope that would hide a person with 2 steps. The whistle came again. Same note, same breath length, a little longer at the end, like you do when you want someone to know where you are without shouting. I didn't say anything back. There's a version of me that thinks I should have called out, announced myself, turned the situation into something simple. Hey, sorry, I followed your flagging. I'm leaving. The version of me that was standing there did not want whoever was making that sound to know more about me than they already knew. I backed up and stepped off the circle's clean edge. I kept my eyes up and on the gaps. I put my hands on the straps by reflex like I could shrink the pack around me. The whistle came again, closer by a little, and the space between the trees felt tighter. Even though I hadn't moved far, I didn't run until my heel caught on a root. And I felt how easy it would be to go down if someone stepped into my line. Then I ran. Running in a forest that isn't groomed for it is different than track speed. It's little bursts and ricochets and reading the ground to steps out. I kept downhill because water is downhill, and the main trail, when it finally swings back toward the creek, is to the left of a drainage I know. I crashed through mountain laurel and got laced by briars. I took one answer on the chin when a branch went exactly where my face was going and popped my lip open. I made more noise than I wanted to, but less than I feared because the brush aided. Every 5 or 6 seconds, I listened, and every time I listened, I didn't like what I didn't hear. No yelling. No, hey, just that whistle now. Not on a fixed spot, but coming and going the way sound does when somebody's moving in the same direction you are and pacing your pace. I stopped once because running blindly is a good way to run into something you caught and move through. I put a tree to my back and tried to pull the map in my head into focus. If I kept dropping, I'd hit the side creek that splits off before the main fork. That creek runs into the one the trail crosses on stepping stones. I didn't need the phone to tell me that because I sat on that creek's bank in summer and watched minnows flash in little pockets and told myself I'd come down from the ridge that way sometime just for the change. I moved again. I knew I was bleeding a little when the salt hit the corner of my mouth, but I didn't feel hurt anywhere that mattered. The ground got damp before I saw the water. It always does. The duff darkens and the plants change from the scrubby stuff that tolerates dry to things that want their feet wet. Then I heard the creek, thin at first, then clearer. It wasn't wide, 2 paces across in places, 3 where the bank gave way, but it was running. The sight of moving water when you have decided to go to water is like a hand on your shoulder. I stepped into it without trying to rock hop because wet feet were a price I was happy to pay for the line. Cold slid up over my ankles, and I kept moving downstream using the bank where it was clean and the water where the bank choked down. I looked behind me twice and both times saw nothing I could put a name to. Once I thought I saw the edge of color, a tiny suggestion of orange low, and to the left, but it might have been a leaf or it might have been my head pulling shape from noise to scare me smart. I didn't know how far I followed that creek before it met the bigger one because distance gets weird when you refocused, but I felt the change when it came. The valley opened maybe 5 more degrees. The sound deepened. The bank got more trampled, not by people, by deer and raccoons and the everything that needs water. I knew where the main trail met this bigger creek. There were 2 big flats where people like to take boots off and dunk their feet in July. From there, the trail bent in a way I could see with my eyes closed. I moved faster. I crossed a gravel bar with prints I didn't stop to read. The whistle didn't come again. I hit the real trail as a break in the mess more than as a sight. Bare dirt, boot prints going both ways, a candy wrapper I hated because of what it meant and loved because of what it meant. I stepped onto it and felt my back straighten the way it does when a door closes behind you. And the thing you worried about is on the other side. I didn't stop there. I turned downstream and put miles between me and that clearing. I saw a couple coming up maybe 10 minutes later. They had a dog on a leash who didn't like me much. I must have looked like a problem. Mud up to my shins. leaves stuck to my calves, a smear of blood where the branch got me. I moved off to give them space. The woman asked if I was okay in the tone you use when you want to be kind, but also not get pulled into something you don't understand. I said I took the wrong line off the trail and bushwalked down and was fine. Now, that was true enough that I could say it without sounding like a liar. She nodded. The man looked at my face and then at the ground like he wanted to find a reason for how I looked. We all kept moving. By the time I got back to the lot, there was a truck there. I recognized. Rangers. Not sirens and lights. Rangers. The TUC every week Rangers in the state rig with the antenna whip and a cooler behind the cab. They were talking to a guy about a new trail closure sign. I walked past and then stopped because consciously choosing not to say something felt like a decision I would regret. I waited for their conversation to finish, raised a hand, and told them what I'd found. I didn't embellish. I said there were new orange ribbons leading off the main trail 5 miles in. I said I followed them for about 20 minutes. I said I lost them and then picked them up again deeper. I said they led to a cleared circle with a deer that had been field dressed and that the antlers had the same tape tied to them. I said I heard whistling behind me and that I left. I said I came down a drainage to the creek and used that to find the trail. I handed over the best description I could give for the location, orientation to the ridge line, the aspect, the kind of stand, the feel of the slope. It wasn't coordinates, but it wasn't a story either. It was information. One of the rangers looked at the other before he looked at me. That small sideways glance told me this wasn't the first time tape had come up. He asked what kind of orange, solid or printed. I told him it was solid and new. He asked if I saw any metal. I said no. He asked if I saw any bait piles. No. Any casings? No. He asked if I took any pictures. I said no, because I didn't take my phone out once I started moving. He didn't scold me for that. He thanked me. He told me they had had some issues lately with people flagging their own lines and that the color orange was used by surveyors, loggers, and hunters, not just trail crews. He said that if it was an illegal baiting station, they'd want to know about it. And if it was just someone being dumb and flagging a shortcut, they'd want to know about that, too. He didn't say anything about the whistling. I did, and he said he'd pass that along. If you want a dramatic chase or a clean answer, this isn't that. I drove home with the window down because I didn't want to smell like inside air. I stripped on the porch and shook the leaves out of everything because I didn't like bringing the woods into the house when I didn't leave the woods on my own terms. I cleaned up the cut on my lip and it looked like nothing once the dried blood was gone. I ate food that didn't taste like anything and sat with a map on my lap like an old person tracing a river with one finger. The line I'd walked, the one I chose to walk, was obvious in my head and useless on paper. You can't print the decisions you make when you're following someone's idea of a path. This is the part where people usually argue about what it was. If you want my take, it was human, not a weird light, not a creature living in the shadows. Someone marked a way to a place they use, and they marked it with a color that makes you think you're supposed to go there. That station didn't happen by accident. The circle wasn't a random patch. The deer wasn't dragged and torn up by scavengers. It was opened like somebody was taught to open it, then tittied in a way that says they work there, not pass through. The tape on the antlers read like someone keeping track of a thing. The way you tie a ribbon around a key that matters. The whistle felt like a way to communicate without words. It didn't feel like a warning, and it didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like a locator. I didn't name the trail here on purpose. I didn't leave it out to keep some secret that doesn't belong to me. I left it out because if it is illegal, the people whose job it is to handle that deserve the space to do it. And if it's just someone's bad idea of marking a side path, I don't want to send anyone into a spot where the ground has already been scraped down to bare dirt for something I don't fully understand. I went back a week later with a friend and we stayed on the main line. We didn't see any orange off to the right where I'd seen it before. If the tape was there again, it wasn't visible from the trail. That doesn't prove anything. It just means it wasn't obvious. If you hike, you've seen tape. Sometimes it's innocent. A boundary line for a study, a one-day flag for a volunteer event, a reminder to someone's future self of where they left a camera. Sometimes it's lazy people trying to stitch together a shortcut without doing the work of reading the land and respecting the route the rest of us walk. And sometimes it's not for you. That's the category I put this in. Now, not for me. I can live with not knowing. I can live with choosing the blaze I know over the tape I don't. I can live with the idea that there are places in common woods that are used for things I do and share. What stuck with me wasn't the deer, it was the circle, the clean edge of it, the way it had been kept. I carry the same pack. I still hike alone. I still like the steady cadence of boot and breath and thinking about nothing. The change is small and total. When I see flagging now any color, I ask what it wants from me and whether I owe it anything. Most of the time I don't. I stay on the paint. I follow the tread. If I want to explore, I use the tools in my pocket and the skills in my head, not a strip of plastic someone else tied to a branch. And if I ever hear that bottleneck whistle again in a place that should only give back the sound of water and wind, I won't stay long enough to sort out who's making it. I already know more than I need to about where that sound leads. I am writing this because I keep replaying that week in my head, and I want a record that starts with what actually happened and sticks to the facts. No embellishments. My buddy and I had planned the trip for months. We wanted something simple, car camping, a couple of day hikes, and cooking over a small fire at night. We picked a national forest I won't name because I don't want to send anyone hunting for this spot. It was dispersed camping, no numbered pads, no water spigots, no camp host, just a tight spur off a forest road where someone had scraped a loose circle of rock into a fire ring. We'd both camped plenty. We had paper maps, a first aid kit, bare canisters we probably didn't need, and a half tank of caution in everything we did. I'm not writing this to dunk on anyone or to make fun of the person we met. I am trying to put down exactly what we saw and heard because the pattern is the part that still unsettles me. The first night was quiet until it wasn't. It was around 11 when we heard the cough. It wasn't a clearing the throat sound from one of us. It came from beyond the fire where the headlamp halo falls off dry and close. We both stood up fast. I grabbed my light and hid it to high. The beam snagged a shape at the edge of the light. Jeans, stained white t-shirt, bare head, no backpack, no water. He was standing the way people stand when they're about to ask directions at a gas station. Hands at his sides, a half step forward like he didn't want to spook us. He said he was lost and asked if he could warm up by the fire. His voice was calm and flat, like he was reading the question from a page. We said, okay. Saying no in that kind of dark is harder than people make it sound. We moved a little to the side and he sat on a log we dragged over. He didn't hold his hands out to the heat. He didn't shiver, he just watched the flames. It felt like we'd invited a quiet cousin into a family circle. For a full minute, nobody said anything. My buddy broke first and asked where his camp was. The man pointed with his chin into a slab of darkness where the trees crowded the spur road and said, "Just over there." No gesture with the hand, just the chin like a dog pointing. More silence. The only noises were the sap popping in the logs and a nightbird calling down the hill. After 5 minutes of that, he stood up in a single movement and asked, "You got any sisters?" It caught me hard enough that I said the first thing that would shut the door. No. He smiled with a lot of teeth and said, "That's a shame." Then he thanked us for the fire and turned. The firelight washed him once and gave back nothing behind him. We didn't hear footsteps. In a forest at night, with dry duff and twigs, you hear something when a person moves. We heard nothing. We both acted cool for maybe 10 seconds and then did the same thing. Killed the fire, flooded the trees with our lights, and scanned while we coiled the hose, doused the ring, threw the stove and food back in the car, and bounced out to the forest road. We slept at a gas station pulleth through that night, slouched in our seats, doors locked, windows cracked for air. It wasn't bravery, it was the most obvious move. Morning made it feel silly in the way daylight always does. We got coffee from the station and stood under that bright humming fluorescent awning with local flyers taped to the window. A dog adoption, a lost ladder, a firewood for sale number written on a tab you tear off. I took my cup to the windshield and saw fresh swipes across the dust, long arcs a little higher than my A-line like someone had wiped it with their forearm. They weren't there when we parked. I can't swear it was him. The station sits on a road with truck traffic. Wine can do weird things with dust, but I noticed it and I'm noting it here. We did the rational thing and drove to the ranger station. The door was locked. Offset start early in the week and a corkboard hung outside with maps and notices. There was a printout warning about increased car break-ins at remote trailheads and a general reminder not to leave food out. There was nothing about a person harassing campers. We stood there long enough to feel dumb, and then we made a plan that felt grown-up. We'd pick a different part of the forest, move at least 10 miles as the crow flies, and camp near a spur that saw more traffic. Not a campground, but not the black hole of privacy we had the night before. If we saw anything off, we'd bail before dark. We told each other out loud that we were not going to turn one weird sentence into the whole trip. We moved southeast on washboard and found a flat bench above a creek that cut through alder and rock. Midday heat crawled up out of the gravel and waves. We walked a loop around the immediate trees, looking for old trash, fresh scat, or anything that said someone lived there. We found a few crushed beer cans, half buried at the edge of the clearing, old enough that the printing had gone chalky. We rolled them into a bag. We rebuilt the fire ring with 3 bigger rocks because the circle was too loose and spread out. We set the tent, but left the fly clipped back in case we wanted to sleep in the car again. It felt controlled and practical. We settled in. Late afternoon, a pickup crawled past a Forest Service green. To people inside, they didn't stop. They just waved. The sun fell, the creek got loud, and the mosquitoes pinpricked the backs of our hands. At dusk, we cooked, ate to fast, and started in on the fire, slow to stretch the wood. Around 9, a low fog threaded between trunks on the far side of the clearing. My buddy, who noticed his tracks, said, "Huh," and pointed his headlamp at the dust on the hood. There were overlapping marks from our gear sliding off and on, and there were smears that looked like prints, not clear fingertips, not some perfect crime show thing, but curved spots like the heel of a hand pressed and dragged. They were at the angle you'd use if you leaned in to see what's inside. We had been standing at the car on and off for the last hour. Could have been us. Could have been him while we sat at the fire facing the other way. The fact that I can't tell, its own problem. At around 10, we heard it again. That dry cough. Same depth. Same casual delivery from the dark line where the spur road came in. My light hit nothing but stacked trunks and alder leaves. I kept the beam steady and said, "Hello." The creek answered. We did something different that second night. We didn't invite anyone in. We kept our backs to the car and our hands closed. No one stepped into the halo. The cough didn't repeat. A minute later, we heard a single stone click, not a footstep. A tap that could be a boot nudging a loose rock. I went down the mental list. Elk, deer, raccoon. It's amazing what your brain will do to shrink a problem. We banked the fire hard, loaded everything but the chairs into the hatch, and we drove to another pull-off, just a wide shoulder above a drainage, and slept there, not talking. Day 3, we took the obvious out and moved to an official campground closer to the highway. Our pride took a hit, but the way we figured it, 2 miles from a county road, and 10 other camps within sight, was an improvement. The camp host was the kind of person you want in charge of a place like that. She had a clipboard, a radio clip to her pocket, and a look like she'd seen every kind of person in the woods. We told her the short version, without the sentence about sisters, because it sounded disspecific and weird. She said they'd had a couple reports of a man in a white t-shirt walking through sites and looking for a friend. She said that in a voice that meant there was no friend. She also said law enforcement had already looped in, so we should call if we saw him. We picked a site where the pad looked over a little slope down to the river. Midday sun on water makes you feel like you were wrong about the dark. We kept the car locked even when we were sitting 5 feet away. We made eye contact with people walking the loop. We did a short hike along the river and back. At the amphitheater bulletin board, there was a damp half sheet for a missing person from late summer, a guy with a beard and a bald cap who never came back from fishing. I felt the picture burning a hole in my mind when we walked away. It was a gut check to see a face and a date. After dinner, we settled into the regular campground soundtrack. Kids on bikes, a couple strumming badly, a dad slapping a charcoal grill that wouldn't catch. Around 9, those sounds thinned. Around 10, the last laughter fell off, and it became a river, fire, and a distant highway. We got up to hit the bathroom before turning in. There was comfort in fluorescent plastic. Coming back to our site, we saw someone standing under the cedar behind our tent. Not moving, just a figure set between trunk and shadow. Stained white t-shirt, jeans. I said loud and level, "Hey man, this is our site." He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. He turned his head slowly like a dog hearing a whistle. Then he took 3 steps downhill and out of the loop light, which is when my buddy hit the headlamp to high and caught the t-shirt bright for half a second before the trunk slid between. It sounds brave to say we followed. We followed for 6 steps, enough to see that the beam found shredded bark and wet earth and then lost detail. Turning your back on the place you sleep is a bad feeling, and we did not do it for long. We walked back fast, got in the car, and drove to the camp host's pad. She answered on the second knock and called it in by radio, calm and clipped, like she'd practiced the exact phrasing. A sheriff's deputy rolled in 20 minutes later. Lights down, no siren. He was kind, took notes, and shined his own beam in careful sweeps. He said what they always say, which is they'd had a few complaints, they'd keep an eye, and that we had done nothing wrong by calling. That last sentence helped. When we got back to our site, our chairs were angled differently, not much. The right-hand chair pointed 3 in farther toward the fire ring. I know how easy it is to move a chair by bumping it with a knee. I also know that we left both chairs square to the fire when we stood up. Those are facts I can hold side by side without forcing a conclusion. We slept in the car with the keys in the cup holder and the headlamps ready on the dash. I woke just before 3 with a stinger of panic in my chest and no dream I could name behind it. The windshield was fogged from our breath in the river air. In that close white fog, there were finger lines. Not writing, not drawing, just a set of streaks from right to left, the way you might wipe a window to see inside. The fog was fresh. Our breath makes it, and the streaks were newer than that, because beads of moisture had formed along the edges. I nudged my buddy and we stared and listened. The campground was quiet as a hospital corridor. I don't scare easy, but the combination of that quiet, the fresh streaks, and knowing we had been in a well-lit area 15 minutes before pushed me into a decision point. We talked low and agreed to cut the trip. The plan was to get a few hours in the car and then go at first light. We made it to light, broke camp in 3 minutes, and made a goodbye stop at the bathroom. When we came out, a man in a faded baseball cap stood by the vending machines. He wasn't the man in the white t-shirt. He was older, eyes on the gravel, and he nodded at us. When my buddy stepped ahead to toss a bag in the bear bin, the cat man asked me if we'd had company in the night. I asked what he meant. He said there was a guy who walked the loops looking for propane tanks and coolers left out, sometimes talking to people. He said almost in a whisper that the guy liked to ask real personal questions to see who'd debite. He followed that with "not my business" and looked away. It was such an ordinary half-con conversation that it steadied me. I thanked him and we rolled out. We decided to drive to a trailhead on the edge of the forest and do one short hike to reset our brains before heading home. It was an easy loop around a little lake posted as 3 miles. The lot was mostly empty. We locked everything and tucked the obvious stuff under the seats out of habit. The trail was smooth and clear. About a mile in, a thin line hung across the tread at shin height. It was fishing line tied between two slender branches. My buddy saw it first and stopped me with a hand across the chest. I touched it with 2 fingers and felt the give. It wasn't old. No dust. No leaf litter attached. Somebody had strung it on purpose. If you hit it at a walk, you'd stumble. If you were running, you'd go down. We stood there a long minute and then snapped it, made the ends obvious, and walked on slower. At the far side of the lake, there's a bench where people watch ducks. We stopped, drank water, and looked at the lot through the trees. Our car was the only one visible. From that distance, the windshield looked like a single dark pane. A person could sit in a car and never be seen. A person could stand behind one and watch the reflections for movement. I'm not saying anyone did. I'm saying that's the thought that ran. And once it starts, it spirals. When we got back, our rear license plate had a smear through the dust like someone had dragged one finger across the numbers. A line about as wide as a dry stick. You're seeing things, my buddy said, and I said, I want to be. We took the highway toward town. A mile from the campground road, a white t-shirt shape stood in the ditch facing the traffic. He wasn't thumbing a ride. He wasn't walking. He was standing like a mile marker. I registered the jeans and the angle of his chin. My buddy saw him too, and when still in the passenger seat, we didn't slow down. 2 turns later, I checked the mirror and saw a tan pickup pull in behind us from a side road. It's the woods. Everything is a pickup. I took the next turn and the truck took it. I took another and the truck took it. My palms went slick and my chest got tight. It could have been nothing. It could have been a person headed the same direction on a grid of limited choices. When the road teed at the county highway, we took a hard right and stayed steady to a grocery store lot. I pulled in and parked nose out. The truck kept going. I realized this section reads like 1,000 posts where people confuse coincidence with intent. I am writing it down anyway because of the way it felt to move from trees and firelight into a broad parking lot and try to convince your body that the open space made you safe. We went inside and bought dumb things we didn't need. Sodas, jerky, a phone charger, because we were doing the normal motions to get our breathing down. At the end of the candy aisle, a person stepped in front of my cart and my shoulders went up into my ears before my brain caught up. It was the camp host from the previous night, off-duty, groceries in hand. She made a point of saying hello, and then softer told us she'd heard radio chatter about a man matching our description seen near the amphitheater bathrooms. She said, they patrol, again that night. She was steady in a way that helped me more than the words. In the parking lot, 2 older guys loaded propane canisters into the back of a car and talked about fishing the next morning like the world hadn't changed. That normally was a bridge we could walk across. We could have gone home then, we should have. We told ourselves we'd do one more night, but make it cautious. Motel on the highway, deadbolt and chain, a morning hike well in the open. The motel had that old carpet cleaner smell and a window unit that rattled. I slept hard until one of those late night sounds that normally means nothing, a muffled thud, snapped me awake. I lay there and listened. It was quiet for a while, and then there was the soft, unmistakable sound of someone trying a car door, not wrenching, the careful pull of a handle to see if a habit failed you, then another door, then another moving down the row like a person testing a line of lockers. I got up and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. The lot was washed in sodium light. My car sat second from left. The first car's front passenger door handle twitched and the figure moved 1 step. White shirt, jeans, thin shoulders. He came to my driver's side and paused. He didn't try my handle. He looked straight into the glass for 2 long seconds, then slid on. It was surgical, no hurry. When he reached the edge of the lot, he turned and scanned back across the cars like a fisherman, looking for floats. He left the lot on foot, walking toward the far end where a chain link fence separated the motel from a stand of second-growth trees. I woke my buddy. We called the front desk, then the non-emergency number the host had given us. The night clerk and the officer both said the same thing. Keep the doors locked, stay inside, they'd send a car. The cruiser rolled in 15 minutes later, did a slow lap with its spots on and departed. I watched the fence line and saw nothing move. Morning came with that hard slam of embarrassment and relief. It's hard to hold both. We checked out. When I opened the driver's door, a smell hit me from the car that wasn't ours. It wasn't smoke or cologne. It was the stale, chalky smell of long, unwashed cotton. It faded fast. On the passenger window, down in the corner where the manufacturer puts the tiny white dot letters, someone had traced a short arc in the condensation, just enough to show you the glass had been touched. We skipped the hike and drove to the sheriff's office in town. The deputy at the desk listened without interrupting and took an actual report. He wrote down our descriptions and asked for the make and color of the truck that had followed us to the grocery. I told him we weren't sure, and he nodded like he expected that answer. He said they'd had other calls. Every now and then, one of us would bring up the most defendable pieces, the camp host, the deputy, the motel clerk, like touch points to prove we hadn't dreamed at all. We avoided the sentence he asked because the shape of it made our stomachs flip. In the days after we got back, I kept thinking of little details I didn't clock in at the moment. The way he pointed with his chin instead of his hand. The way he watched the fire and not us, like the flames were the thing he actually wanted. The way he moved without sound through the duff that crackled under our boots. Each detail on its own is nothing. Together they make a picture I don't like looking at. I'm not trying to wrap this in advice. I don't want to make a list. I'm writing it down because it happened over several days and in different places, not just at that first fire ring. And that spread is what kept me off balance. The first time we heard the cough, I thought we were dealing with a single weird moment. It could have been a fingernail. It could have been my kid brushing it when she walked past. I don't know. I know. I stared at it until my neck went hot. That night, I lay awake and thought about the firelight shining off a stained t-shirt and a question asked as casually a weather report. I don't have a good way to end this except to say we did the simple unromantic thing and change how we camp. We still go out. But we don't do dispersed sites anymore, and we let people know where we are down to the spur road. It doesn't make me feel brave to write that. It makes me feel alive. If you read this and think we overreacted, I get it. If you read it and recognize some version of the man I'm describing, I hope you call it in the first time and not the third. I don't need this to be a movie to know it was real. The cough was real. The way the chair pointed at the fire was real. The finger lines in the fogged windshield were real. The question was real. And so was the way the man smiled after I said no. We never heard his name. We never saw his camp. We saw him at the edge of every circle we drew, like he was waiting for us to leave a gap. I had run this slot once before with a different partner and carried the same worn rope, a half length with an ugly sheath scar I'd taped. I was with Dan this time, who keeps his gear clean and his words cleaner. He's good in narrow places and does not pretend to be what he isn't. We both knew the basic rules. Start early, watch the clouds, read the rock. Neither of us said out loud the rule that mattered most. Miles distant storms can flash flood slots because the plateau is one roof and the canyon is the downspout. We down-climbed a short chimney, then a second, and set a hand line for a tight squeeze. Dan doesn't like something with an awkward flare at any level that wants to spit you into space before you re-ready. By late morning, we were 100 feet below the rim and maybe a mile from the first real constriction, the place where the canyon tightens to a shoulder's width, and the walls get that polished, waxy look from past floods. There were dark streaks on the sandstone several feet above our heads, damp like bathtub rings. The line of blue remained unbroken. We talked quietly about options, and then in the same tone decided to keep moving. Backing out of that slot would have meant reversing a couple vertical problems that are easier to go down than up. And neither of us wanted a rope-up retreat with unknown anchors. The next landmark ahead was a chalk stone lodged above a pour-off. A cube of rock the size of a desk, with a comfortable top enough for one person to sit and swing a leg. A place I remembered as a natural rest stop. Past that, the slot pinched tighter and took an S-bend where the light goes dim, and the only way through, a sideways shuffle with toes on nothing and back pressed to the smooth wall. Our thinking, which I have replayed without locating the flaw I want, was to get to the chalk stone while we figured out what the sound meant. Meanwhile, the damp rings kept their height above us like measurements somebody had left behind. The walls were cool to the touch, and small sand grains filmed my palms in a way that said the last water hadn't fully gone. That's a tell I know now. I should have weighted more heavily. In narrow country, the first sign of trouble is often sound, and the second is silt, where it should be dust. The pebble that skittered past my boot didn't look like anything until it knocked to more loose, and they pattered like a handful of beads on tile. Then a trickle appeared from the bend above. Not clear, but tan, then brown in a way that doesn't make ripples, only a moving skin. I've heard people describe the first floodwater as chocolate milk. That's true about the color, but the more important thing is the texture. It moves like something mixed too thick and carries sand in suspension so that your hands come away polished in a single stroke. Dan said my name in a plain voice that would have been right for reading a label. I said, "Okay," and we both reached for high holds even though the rock was slick, because you do what every animal does first. You get higher if you can. The wall arrived with no preface I can describe, just not water, and then water through a slot narrower than my shoulders. It wasn't tall like movie waves. It was dense, and it carried branches and shredded grass and foam that collected at the corners where the canyon made a brief ledge. The sound went from hum to roar in one breath. My chest surprised me by taking a loud gasp without my permission. Dan had one knee on the chalk stone and one boot scumming the far wall, and I had both hands on the stone below, hanging on the lip by my fingertips, while the flow tried to decide where to put me. He pulled up to sit, which made space for me exactly note where. I love my friend, and I also thought in those seconds about my own body weight and grip strength, and it is an unpleasant thing to report both truths at once. There was no platform except the top of that stone, and only enough of it for one person. The other option was the blind chimney just before the bend, an off-width slit in the right wall that I had noticed when we passed, but ignored because it looked like a dead end. I went for the chimney because there was another place my feet could go that didn't say river, and because I am smaller, and because I didn't want both of us to fight for the same square foot of safety. It was a sideways move into a dark seam maybe a foot wide at shoulder level and tapering with height. I jammed my forearms then my knee, and the lip chewed the skin there in the way sandstone, buzzed methodically and hot. The flood hit the bend and climbed my thighs and tried to peel me off the wall. Sand rashed my calves fast enough to feel like heat. Somewhere in it, a log the diameter of my forearm railed past and pinned for a second against my hip and then was gone. Dan was above and to my left, his boots grating on the chalk stone, both hands on nothing. The white noise of the water filled the space where words should have gone. I don't remember him saying anything soulful or me answering. I remember the feel of the chimney tightening until my chest creaked. I buried my shoulder blade into one rib of stone and breathed in a measured way, slow enough to fit, and then I stopped thinking and tried to become friction. The first 20 minutes, if it was that long, had one job: not to be struck by the bigger pieces. The flood had lifted sand and branches and had a foam head on it like a river after a rain, but this was in a corridor not wider than a person. Sticks jammed at my thigh and then freed and slapped the downstream wall and turned end for end. Once a rope of grass packed with clay wrapped my wrist and I had to work it off finger by finger. The chalk stone sounded hollow when the logs hit it, and 3 times I thought the stone might move. It didn't. What changed? And this is the thing people do and understand if they haven't seen it, is that after the first push past, the water stayed high. There's an idea of a flood as a single blow. But in a slot, the pulse comes through on a hydrograph you can't see and it sets a new normal. We were in the new normal, chest deep moving brown with a pressure that worked on us like steady hands. The roar leveled into a sound that hid all other sounds. We started to feel our hold zeroed. The little shelves that had been crisp an hour before turned soft under our palms as if somebody filed them while we looked away. The grit that made traction burned it away, too, and the walls grew slick where they had been rough. I angled my back and feet and felt my right boot sole start to peel. I reached for the wall with my bare hand to check that I was not imagining it, and the callus on my palm shaved off like soap. Dan kept both hands pressed down flat on the top of the stone because curled fingers hurt too much and because even the smallest nubbing had become marble. We exchanged maybe 6 words in that hour, none of them deep. "You good? Still here? Don't move, copy." There was no room for speeches. If a person had seen us from above, we would have looked like barnacles. The decision that changed the shape of the afternoon wasn't whether to run. That had been decided for us. The decision was which of us would move and which would hold the only spot that wasn't being sanded out from under our bones. Waiting felt like the cleanest choice and also like the riskiest one, because waiting meant letting the erosion process continue and betting that the river would fall before the rock did. Moving meant one of us had to commit to an unknown in a narrow place with force working at us from hip level. I suggested I tried to climb higher in the blind chimney to see if it opened above the bend. I didn't say the second half of the sentence, which was that if it did, I might wedge in and not come out. But if it went, maybe we could get off the floor. Dan nodded once and didn't argue, because there wasn't anything else to propose that didn't take his legs off the single surface they had. I went from jam to jam, chest, back, knee, a little at a time, without the speed that gym climbers think they will have in a situation like that. The water felt like a patient hand against my hips, and my harness snagged on the wall 100 times because the webbing stuck where the rock was rough and slid where the rock was glass, which meant it always did the opposite of what I wanted. I took off my pack by inches and clipped it to a loop because getting light mattered more than having food. The chimney narrowed enough that I lost the boot on my right foot in a torque and felt the cool of the wall on my skin. Above my head, the seam kinketted and I had to turn my face to breathe. The sound changed in the smaller space. It became a dull pressure in my ears instead of noise. I put my cheek to the stone and felt it vibrate. The smell up there was clay and mouse. Twice I thought about trying to place a cam in a constriction. And twice I remembered that cams won't hold in sugary sandstone under load when the shape's wrong. I used what I had, which was my body and one hex old enough to be called vintage. I wedged that hex in a choppy crack as a directional, not because it would save a fall, but because it gave my brain a leash. The chimney topped at a scallop that was almost a shelf, and then passed it a tight sideways tube that turned and seemed to widen. There was sky as a thin pale slash, which told me the tube was an infinite and that there might be room to stand. I could not see beyond the bend. I banged a carabiner twice on the wall and waited. Dan banged his once in response. That had been our agreement before the water rose. That carabiner on stone would be our signal when voice was useless. I tried the tube sideways and found that my chest fit if I breathed out and that my hips did if I twisted, and that the wall there was dry and rough in at least one spot like a new idea. I worked through the first 3 feet and then stopped because the tube narrowed abruptly and the far side fell away into a pour-off with an overhang. It was not a way out. It was the ceiling of a room we could not reach from below. A trap door without a ladder. I backed down a little, tried to look again, and confirmed what I had seen. People get rescued from spots like that if somebody knows where they are, and if the river cuts them slack. Nobody knew, backing down the chimney while the water shoved my hips and tailbone wasn't brave. It was slow and reasonable. Every choice felt like that. Not noble, just small and careful, and the only one. When I rejoined the level of Dawnstone, we couldn't meet eyes because the geometry didn't allow it. I told him what I'd seen, and he said, "Okay," in the same tone he uses when he checks a knot. The river began to tick down sometime after, not dramatically, but enough that the foam line on the wall made a new ring lower than the last. Floods don't often recede in grand gestures. They sag in increments. The light in the slot shifted as the day leaned toward noon and gave the water a metallic look, even though there was no sunbeam, and the sound fell into a register that let us hear each other at 3 words a sentence if we leaned hard to our left. We tested the holds above Dawnstone and found one crisp edge that had not yet rounded. We agreed on 3 steps. I would traverse back into the flow, get to his perch. We'd stack bodies to reach a notch I could see at shoulder height, and from there, I would chimney to a ledge that looked like it wouldn't crumble. If the ledge held, I'd anchor the rope around a horn that might exist just out of sight. If the ledge didn't hold, I'd go back to where I was and we tried to outweigh the river until the light told us we'd run out of time. I moved on account, not because counting controls water, but because it makes your body obey. Step, press, breathe, move. The flood still had enough force to spin my hips out if I let my feet drift, but I didn't let them. I made the chalk stone and set my chest against Don's back. He set his palms flat and let me make a platform. My forearm went numb under his boot and then woke. I stood and pushed my spine into the crack and reached for the notch. My fingers found the first part of it sound and the second part rotten. I lay back anyway, because if a thing holds for 1 second, it can hold for 2. And sometimes that's enough. From the notch, I got into a better chimney that was less polished. And the friction made that old happy rasping sound you hear when the rock wants you to stay. I reached the ledge and tested it with flat hands, and it didn't crumble, not at once. So, I shifted weight and then more weight until it was my whole weight, and the ledge said nothing. The horn was there as a bumped bulge around the corner, small but real. I slung it with the rope, because webbing was buried on my harness under paste the color of coffee. I lowered the loop and shouted, and after 2 tries, the words landed. Dan clipped and came off the stone with a tighter body than I've ever seen, moving through the flow like he knew every piece of furniture in a dark room. We sat on that upper shelf with our backs pressed into the corner and our feet braced, and we did the thing you do when you have a little room. You start inventory. No injuries that would change a plan except the grazes everyone gets in slots. 1 barefoot for me, 1 pack gone to the river that had the good headlamp in it. To ell of water left between us, which would have been funny if we had been the kind of people who laugh when their mouths taste silt. We waited until the river fell from chest to waist to thigh, and then the push turned into a pool and the bottom felt like bottom again. We crabbed sideways for 30 feet to a place where there was a cross joint that let us break out of the main drain into a trashy side crack with a jam of tumbleweeds that looked dumb and saved our lives. Above that was what passes for a weakness in those walls. A slope if you were generous, with pencil-wide footings and 1 slick plate the length of a countertop. We did that piece the way kids steal apples. Fast and quiet and topped to a shelf with coarse sand that hadn't been watered yet. The silence that came with air and space felt big enough to stand in. The walkout was ordinary. That deserves to be noted. The sky stayed blue. On the far horizon to the north, there were anvils with shirred tops. Perfectly normal late summer monsoons marching across somebody else's county. The wash we followed back to the truck was damp and smelled like clay, and there were logs the size of fence posts arranged in makeshift geometry where the flow had braided. We passed a boulder with a fresh scrape that you could read like a diagram. Here's where the river had lifted it, and here's where it had set it down. The truck started. Our clothes left a brown-tied line on the seats. We ate what we had left and didn't say much. I wore 1 boot and 1 sock and felt rocks through the thin part of my foot for a week after that night when we turned the water on in the sink at the motel. It ran clear, and that also deserves to be noted. People ask later what we did wrong because it's comforting to find the mistake, circle it, and believe you wouldn't make it. There are answers I can give. We knew there were storms, even if they were 50 miles off, and we went anyway because the sky above us was clean. We saw damp rings on the wall and called them older than they were. We heard the sound and used minutes, discussing it in a place where minutes mattered. We moved past options because moving felt like progress. If there is a list of seeds you can plant for floods, we watered all of them. Sound first, then silt, then skittering rock, then a trickle that turned brown, then the wall that carried logs and sand and foam, and then the part nobody rehearses, when the first blow passes and the water stays high and the canyon becomes a machine that keeps operating with you inside it. In that machine, people don't drown the way movies stage it. The river pins you under a branch, or the sand builds up around your legs and sets like cement, or your foothold wears away while you're using it, and you go from held to falling in the space between 2 swift breaths. It's not dramatic, it's mechanical. If there's a morality here, it's not complicated. The dessert doesn't hold a grudge. It takes what it needs to take and leaves the rest sorted by size. We chose who moved and who held. I picked the blind chimney because I was small and because a bad choice is still a choice and you own it. Dan stayed on the stone because to bodies on 1 square foot is not to times safer. Afterward, we did what people do. We cleaned the grit from the cuts and wrapped a new layer of story over the old one. Every time I walk past an air vent and hear a steady hum, I think of that canyon behaving like a pipe and consider how many roofs feed one gutter. I check forecasts now like a superstition. Morning, night, the night before, the radar loops, the storm motion, the basins. I notice damp rings. I notice silt in places where there shouldn't be any. I do and pretend I am brave, and I do and make speeches about respect for nature, because the word respect has been asked to do too much work already. I will say this in a voice you can trust. We were lucky, and luck is not a plan. When I close my eyes on quiet nights, what I see isn't the wall of water. It's my palm on stone that used to be rough and had turned smooth while I held it, as if time had sped up just for us and then gone back to its regular pace without apology.